Okay, hello everyone and welcome. I'm Zach Harkness with MMA Island, and today I'm joined by UFC play-by-play broadcaster and commentator Brendan Fitzgerald. Hello and welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Zach, I'm doing great, Zach. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
No problem. So, I just want to jump into the first question here. The first thing I want to ask you is about empty arena shows. Now, you commentated on the Overeem versus Harris card last Saturday, which was held in front of no audience. What were the biggest differences you noticed between commentating with and without a crowd?
I think there's more talking from the broadcasters when there's no crowd. I think sometimes, obviously, with a full arena, it gets pretty loud. Everyone's excited, and you kind of let the fans and the moment speak for itself. But even though you have some great fights happening, if there's no crowd to kind of react to it, there's less of that buildup and that tension in the arena. So instead of kind of letting it breathe and having the crowd have a big moment, letting people watch along like as if they were in the arena, it's really just a static and silent environment. So you kind of have to fill in those gaps a little bit more. I'd say that was probably the biggest difference.
So like you have to feel more pressure on yourself as a commentator because the fans might be paying more attention to you instead of like listening to the crowd. Do you feel that pressure at all?
I don't think you feel the pressure. It's just a matter of being a little bit more, not more prepared, but just being aware that you're going to have to talk a little bit more, I think. And with having a 3-man broadcast booth, which we had in Florida all week, and we'll have, I think, going forward, it allows for more conversation back and forth. I was working with Felder and Bisping, and so they were kind of going back and forth, and maybe more talking than would usually be happening if there was a full arena and it was a lot of crowd and that sort of thing. So I don't think it's more pressure that fans are more tuning into what you're saying. I just think it's just a little bit different in the presentation of it, and how it goes along with the fights. Because if you'll notice, like if all three of us stop talking, it gets really quiet really quickly. And so I think just making sure that it's not too quiet at any moment, and keeping the energy of the broadcast up.
Right. So you mentioned Michael Bisping, and while you do have many commentating duos, one of my favorite things that have come out of ESPN is the commentating duo of yourself and Michael Bisping, because you guys are just great. So how did the Bisping partnership come to fruition, and did they plan on putting you in another duo before?
I think one of the strengths that I've always had is the ability to work well with whoever I'm paired with. And this goes before even working for the UFC. I just try to find chemistry with everybody that I'm on TV with, and have a good rapport with them. And so with the UFC, there's not real teams, if you will. I guess it kind of just turns into it like accidentally almost. It's not like we started using Bisping on commentary and they're like, all right, Brendan and Bisping, that's going to be a team. And then, John and Rogan and Cormier or whatever, because, Anik does a lot of different shows with Dominic Cruz and Cormier, and then Joe Rogan does the pay-per-views. And then he's worked with Bisping. He's worked with Paul Felder a little bit more. Like, it just is kind of a rotation. It just so happens that, yeah, on an event to event basis, I'm basically the number 2 play-by-play guy, I guess you would say, or, the one behind Anik in terms of North America and South American shows. And so I'm working with Bisping because he's kind of newer to it. And it just kind of falls that way because Felder still fights. And then Felder also kind of joins John Gooden and Dan Hardy as like an international crew. So, yeah, it kind of has turned into a partnership, albeit accidentally. They never came to us and still haven't even addressed that, like, you guys are a team. But I think because I have gotten the chance to work with him repeatedly, and he's such a big personality, I think that we mesh well together, and we know when to have fun, when to keep it serious with fight action, when to make fun of each other and that sort of thing. And it just makes for a better broadcast when I feel like people can kind of laugh along with us and be in on the jokes, and feel like they're hanging out with us. I've always thought that's the most successful form of sports broadcasting, when you feel connected with the people who are kind of watching along with you. And so it's been a blast.
And I can completely agree. It's like, I don't know, it's like almost more interactive and fun when you guys are like joking around, but also can switch between being serious. It's almost like, we're there with you guys watching the event. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I want to move into the next question here, and it wasn't that long ago that you found yourself on UFC fans' radars. So how did you find yourself working for the UFC? Did they reach out to you, or vice versa?
Yeah, they reached out to me when they were starting Dana White's Contender Series. So that was back in 2017, 3 years ago now. And it was right around this time 3 years ago that they were looking for broadcasters for that new series that they were going to start. Nobody even really knew about what it was going to be and what it was going to be like and that sort of thing. And I had recently been at ESPN covering college sports at ESPNU, and I was part of kind of a bigger layoff there back in April of 2017. So I was I guess I was publicly available. I was part of the layoffs, which kind of made news because there was a lot of high profile names at ESPN that got let go. And I wasn't one of the higher profile names, but I was just a broadcaster that was now kind of on the open market looking for another job. And that's exactly when they were looking for broadcasters for that show. And so my boss kind of kept his eye on that news, and they were lining people up for auditions. So they brought me in for an audition along with a handful of other broadcasters and fighters and commentators and that sort of thing. And so that's really how I got looped into the UFC. I started with that first season of the Contender Series, and then just kind of thrived with it, really liked it, meshed well with the team, and here I am 3 years later still with them.
Yeah. Did you ever think going into your broadcasting career before you eventually found yourself with the UFC that you would ever be commentating on MMA fights?
No, not at all. It was never really part of the plans. But as you get older in life, you kind of learn to embrace that there's a lot of things that don't go according to plan, and it usually works out for the best, and this certainly has.
I would agree. So did you find yourself like as a fan of the UFC and MMA before you started commentating?
Not really. I was a big sports fan that watched the crossover fights. The Conor McGregor fights and Ronda Rousey fights and Brock Lesnar fights and that sort of thing. The events that really crossed over and were on at sports bars and things like that, I was kind of clued into. But the other part of it is that when you're going to cover sports, you really kind of have to be all in on what you're going to cover. And that gives you less time to be a fan of other things. So when I first started with the UFC, I remember thinking like, man, I feel like I'm a big enough sports fan where I should have known more about it because of how much sports I was watching and that sort of thing. But then I realized, well, UFC events are on Saturday nights, and I worked at a college sports network. So every Saturday night, it was wall-to-wall football for me, and then it was wall-to-wall basketball and basketball season. And I didn't really have time. I mean, we had 8 TVs in our studio at ESPN, and it's like there were 8 different college football games on. There was just really no time. While if you're going to cover something well at the national level at ESPN, then, you can like something as a fan and catch up with it afterwards. But really, that wasn't part of my agenda at that point. Like I just really needed to know the ins and outs of what I was covering and kind of handle it as a professional. And then, the UFC, I'll say the thing about the UFC that I truly love more than any other sport that I've covered is that it never feels like a chore to watch it. If you're covering college basketball, you might not want to watch like 10 basketball games in a night. You might not want to just, there's more than 300 basketball teams in college basketball. So it gets a little redundant. And then, that some of the games aren't as big of a deal. You're like, well, these teams aren't ranked. They're not going to win the title. They're not going to be in the hunt for it. But with the UFC, it's like every fight I want to watch, even if I'm not working the event, I want to sit there for 6.5 hours and I want to watch every single fight. I want to know what's going on in our sport. I'm truly compelled by it. I love the production aspect of what we do and our team that puts together the features and that sort of thing. I want to see all of it. It's never a chore to watch it. So
I would completely agree with that statement. Now I'm going to move into the next question here. So the working with the UFC, it's given you a lot of opportunities to travel to some pretty cool locations to go commentate. Yeah. So which of the locations that you've been to was your favorite?
I really love New Zealand. had never been to that part of the world before, and I was there in February. And so that was a blast. Auckland is a really cool city. I kind of want to get back and explore like the country of New Zealand and kind of more of the remote areas, but loved Auckland and loved that whole vibe. And the people are friendly and there's no language barrier. And it's, it was really cool. I really love traveling. Um, I just like finding, not every place is awesome. Sometimes we're in, a random U.S. city and we're at a hotel that's on a highway and you can't really explore it. So that one is kind of just like, like Raleigh, North Carolina. I had plenty of fun in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our crew was on the road and that sort of thing, but didn't really get to explore what it's all about. And then when it's the United States, you kind of know it already. You know the chain restaurants that are around, there's a Starbucks on every corner and that sort of thing. But I love international travel, especially like Europe's great. Like Liverpool, England was a blast. That was a great weekend when Darren Till beat Stephen Thompson. So, and then Stockholm, Sweden. Stockholm was really cool last year. And I'm still only like 2 years in, really. I'm like, 2018 and 2019 were my 2 years on the road. And then obviously not doing a lot of traveling this year after the early batch. So I'm not as seasoned as some of the others are, but obviously I've been to a lot of places. And yeah, man, I look forward to it every time.
Are there any places that you're hoping to go commentate someday, hoping to go visit with the UFC?
Love to go to Australia. I mean, I loved New Zealand so much, and then everybody just has wonderful things to say about Australia, especially Melbourne as a city. And then like Europe is always great. I guess Singapore too. I don't know if we're going to get back to Singapore with regularity, but man, people have cool things to say about Singapore. I loved Korea too last December. Korea was a cool place to go check out. So, a lot of it depends on the weather though too. Like places tend to be awesome when the weather's nice, and then you go up to Ottawa and it's like not quite spring or super warm yet and it's rainy and cloudy, then you're like, well, Ottawa seems like a cool city, but it could have been better if it was sunny out. So that sort of thing. But any chance I can get to go to Europe, Prague was cool, man. You're right. It's like you bring back all these things and think about it, it's quite a gig.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. So I want to go to another international location, and I think you knew this one was coming, but I want to ask about Mexico City.
Yeah.
So, can you walk me through like your perspective and thought process from what you saw from like the eye poke to fans throwing bottles from the stands and you going under the table?
Yeah. So at first, so the eye poke happens. It always looks way more innocent than it is, especially that one because it wasn't like an in the eye poke. Sometimes you see them and they're kind of deep in the eye and it's like one of those. This one was more like a scrape down, but if the guy's eyes open, I mean, I don't know how that feels, but I can't imagine it feels great. So when it first happens, you go, okay, we're going to reset here. We're only 15 seconds into the fight. So it kind of stinks that you have all that buildup and then you kind of calm down. But then I want to say it was like after a minute or two, because usually they can blink it out within 1 or 2 minutes, or it's like it's clear after a minute or two that they're going to be okay. But after like 2 minutes, it wasn't clear that he was going to be okay. And I want to say he was standing right in front of us, or he was standing kind of like up to the left of us. And I just like was looking up at him and was really struggling. And then the fans started really booing. And I can only imagine what he was feeling there. And then like once your body is kind of trying to deal with something, but then there's more stress on top of it, that's never good. So I just remember thinking like, man, he's already dealing with this. He's about to be in a fight. Now the fans are booing. He wants his eye to be better. And like, he's just stressed out. And like, if his body's just not responding at this point, like, I don't know if it's going to respond in time. I knew that if they stopped the fight, that, an hour later, we could have probably had that fight because his eye could have like rested. And I don't know if something was major enough or whatever, but I was just like, man, this might be tough. What's the situation here? How long do they give him? And Herb was in there and saying like he needs 5 minutes. And then as it kind of went longer and longer, I remember thinking like he's not going to be able to fight. Like if he can't do it now, he's not going to be able to. And like this stinks because this was an awesome fight, as we saw in Boston. Would have wanted 2 more rounds of it. And then as soon as he waved off the fight, I didn't think that my mind didn't go to what's going to happen if they wave off the fight in the arena until it actually happened. So then Herb waves off the fight, take one look to my left, and I saw like just like a splash of something. Somebody threw a cup or whatever. And like I've been at games, in Boston where I'm from when I was a kid, like the ref makes a bad call and here come the beer cups down on the ice in a hockey game or whatever. So I've seen that. So as soon as I saw that first one, I was like, oh, this is going to be a full kind of thing. I was like, this is going to get not like nasty, but it's like everyone's going to throw what they have. It's just, one after the other. And I was just kind of sitting there at first. And then Cup came into our table from the side. And our stage manager kind of like went like this and kind of like leaned into me and probably got splashed or something or whatever. And so he kind of went down. And I remember thinking, like, first of all, I don't want to get hit with anything, even if it's just liquid, whatever. I just don't feel like getting hit with anything. Second of all, if I'm broadcasting this way and like the action is this way and I want to look at it, first of all, there's no fight to keep track of anymore. But I get pelted with something and then I'm reacting to that on TV and like, oh, just the startled reaction of getting hit with a water balloon from behind or whatever. So I remember thinking like, well, let me turn out and face it so then I can kind of see what's coming at me. And then I was just like, I'm just going to sit under the table. I'll be protected on like basically all sides but what's right in front of me. And I can look right up at the screen. So it was like, it was less fear of, there was a part of me that's like, you never know what people are going to throw in the crowd. Like people could throw anything. They throw a phone, hit you on the head. Like they could throw a bunch of stuff. I remember being at Fenway Park when I was a kid and a guy threw his shoes at somebody because they were like a White Sox fan and it was a Red Sox game. So I just remember thinking like, there's crazy people. And at this point of the night, they've had a few drinks. So let me just take as much risk out of the equation as I can, sit under the table, look up, stay cool and calm and be able to actually commentate and talk through the situation without kind of looking over my shoulder and getting pelted with something. So, I mean, and then people had fun with it. And then I had fun with it at the hotel. I sat under the table with a drink afterwards. And it was like, some people like just won't let it go. Some people, that's like their first comment on every post that I have on social media. And they're like, oh, don't hide under a table this time. And I'm just like, listen, you can't, there's no being tough enough to fight off people throwing stuff from like 50 feet away in a crowd. Like if you just stand at the bottom of a theater and people just start throwing stuff at you, it doesn't matter how tough you are, you're just going to get hit with stuff. So I'm like, I'm not going to out tough this. I'm just going to try to stay as calm as I can on the broadcast and kind of describe the situation because I knew we weren't going to go to commercial. So yeah, it's become a little chapter in my story now, but I'm able to laugh at myself. So I enjoy it.
That's a really important thing. Now, would you like go back to Mexico City if they say like you want to go back to Mexico City and commentate? Oh yeah, want a second chance of redemption?
Yeah. The thing is, that happened because of what happened in the fight. I just mentioned how friendly the people were in New Zealand. Let's say, God forbid, in the Felder Hooker fight, and Hooker's the hometown guy that everybody wants to see in the main event and whatever. Let's say he eye pokes Felder in 15 seconds and then Felder can't continue because of an eye poke. They would throw beer just as readily as the Mexican fans threw beer, and in the States, the same thing. Some people got on their high horse and they were just like, oh, Mexico City fans should be ashamed of themselves. It's like that happens everywhere. That would happen in the United States. That would happen certainly in Liverpool, England, based on what I've heard. They're just like, oh, he's never been in a bar during a football game in England because that happens all the time. So, yeah, I mean, that trip, that weekend was a lot of fun already in Mexico City, and the neighborhood we were in was fine, and I would absolutely go back there. It'd be great.
All right. So that was a obviously crazy moment, and being a UFC broadcaster, you get to see and hear things many people can't on the TV. So I want to know, what was the craziest moment, maybe besides that one, that you've witnessed cage side?
Craziest moment, man, that's a tough one because like, are you talking about like fight action crazy or like something that happened like other than fights?
It can be either.
Fights. I mean, Man, I was like just there last week. I mean, just because it's fresh on the mind, and like Darren Elkins' face last weekend was quite crazy. Where I don't know how I didn't get blood on me. I guess because we sat a little bit further back, but that was the bloodiest fight that I've called. Where like Landwehr hits him and it's just like a splatter of blood. I just remember not seeing that before in my few years. And it's one of those, like, Elkins is just like that. He has scar tissue and he's a veteran, so he bleeds easily. Kind of like Nate Diaz, why he bleeds so easily. And man, that was kind of crazy, where I was kind of almost like cringing while calling the fight for that whole third round, because the cuts are just opened up and his face is basically just red and shiny. And I don't know if I had called one of those before. I'd watched one, like an old Joe Lozon fight, and just like a Joe Soto, I remember, had a bad cut one time. But I would say, yeah, I guess I would say that one, just because it was so recent that nothing else comes to mind.
And now, from seeing to hearing, and I bet you hear a lot of like trash talk in between fighters that many of us can't hear from the TV. Is there any significant examples of like great fighting trash talk that you've heard as a commentator?
Not really. Like, honestly, they don't. Well, I don't want to say they don't talk, but I mostly hear what you guys hear on the broadcast, because when I'm sitting down there, when you're sitting octagon side, then certainly you can hear a lot and see a lot, and you're right up close and personal. But our job as like broadcasters, we have the headphones on, and I don't think people realize how noise canceling those are. So it's like, those are, so that our producers and the TV truck can talk to us, but then also so that we can hear what's on the broadcast. So when the music comes in to go to commercial, we hear it, and the promotions and the commercials and that sort of thing. Well, not really commercials, but like the features and all that sort of stuff that's on the screen, we can hear it because of those headphones. And that really does block out a lot of the sound. So if you guys can hear the trash talk like during the fight, then we'll hear it too in there. But it's not like I take my headphones off so that I can hear what they're saying if they're trash talking while we're calling the fight. That's one thing that's kind of unique about the no fans, is like, if they are talking, a lot of people can hear it, and then we'll kind of know to kind of shut up a little bit if it is good trash talk, or if it is kind of interesting to hear. But yeah, no, I don't. The fighters either don't talk that much, or they talk and we can't really hear it during the course of a fight because of everything else that's going on.
So you mentioned like with the headphones, you can like talk directly to the producers. I've always wondered, like, when you're commentating, do they say in your ear like, okay, place the advertisement right here now? Because I've always wondered how the ads are so perfectly placed.
Yeah, that's exactly what they do. We have scripts that scripts, as it were. It's not like we script out what we're going to call with a fight, because we don't know, but the scripts that we refer to are all the promotional materials that need to be read, or round 3 is brought to you by P3, the official protein snack of UFC. Like, when we're coming back from break for that third round, then it's just like, all right, P3, read and go, and I know to read it. And that's why we have a stage manager, and he kind of keeps all that. But yeah, like in the middle of a fight, UFCstore.com, right? And he'll just be like, all right, you got your UFC store copy? And then kind of I have the card, and I give him a thumbs up, or I'll tell him yes on like my kind of little talk back button to him. And then he just goes, okay. And then like he'll tell the other guys, he's like, all right, let Brendan get in here with the read. And then he'll be like, okay, go. And I'll be like, UFCstore.com is your place for all blah 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 blah. And then they fire it up on the graphic, because they're all kind of coordinated and ready for those things that we need to read throughout the night.
All right. Now, during your tenure as a UFC commentator, you have taken up BJJ to much publicity for some reason. Now, how has your experience with BJJ been so far, and how many years off are you from submitting Bisping?
Oh my goodness. Bisping, apparently he has some bad knees. No, he does. He's had a lot of knee surgeries, but he promises, though, when his knees are all better, we're going to grapple. He's going to tap me out like 10 times in 2 minutes. So I don't know when I'll get Bisping, but yeah, no, it's been great. I started last September, and I remember like I was kind of encouraged by not my direct boss, but his boss, and we were having a conversation. He's just like, hey, have you had any training, or had any thoughts of doing jiu-jitsu or any martial arts, just to understand it better? And I was like, It's like, yeah, that would be kind of cool, but I never really kind of put it into practice. And so, like in 2018, I did some Muay Thai classes because grappling seemed like something I didn't want to do. It was just like, that seems a little too intimate for me, at least at the start. I was like, but I'll strike. Like the striking is cool, and obviously everyone loves a knockout. So started with that, and then that was okay, and that's still a good workout. I usually like hit a bag. I kind of realized early on, like, I don't really want anybody hitting back at me, and not because I can't take it or I don't like it. I think I actually would really like it the more I got into it, but I don't want to go on TV with a black eye or a busted tooth or a busted lip, really. So I was like, well, maybe I'll just kind of hit the bag and do my striking that way, or hit pads with somebody. But then last September, I was encouraged by John Gooden, because John's done jiu-jitsu for a while. He's pretty well versed in that, and so he's just like, yeah, try it out, you learn a lot or whatever. And so I was like, screw it. I kind of was in touch with Eric Nixick, who's a MMA coach at Extreme Couture, and he's just like, yeah, man, if you want to come in and do some jiu-jitsu, whatever, like, just come on in and learn some stuff. And so I did, and really liked it more than I even thought I would. Like, I was ready to like it and enjoy it, but even kind of getting dominated early on, like, I still enjoyed it. And then when you start figuring it out a little bit, I liked it a little bit more. And then they kind of gave me some junk on the broadcast about it and that sort of thing. So it's kind of taken on that life of its own. But I can't wait to get back to do it. Obviously, like with the hold on. Sorry about that. Obviously, with like the situation that we're in, there's not a lot of grappling going on. But yeah, no, I like it a lot. Hopefully I can get to Bisping, and I'm sure somebody will be there with a camera, and we'll see what happens.
I was just about to say, is there any way that can be watchable? That might even be a pay-per-view thing. That would be great.
Yeah, I've rolled with Gooden too, and that was like the big thing, because I supposedly called out Gooden, even though I was just kind of joking around. And me and Gooden have rolled several times, and so he kind of takes it easy on me now. But maybe we get one of those on video. But certainly if I ever roll with Bisping, we'll have to get it on video, and I'll throw it out on my Instagram.
Yes, that would be awesome. So now, as many people here know, oh wait, never mind. You've taken on the responsibility of commentating Dana White's Contender Series. Now, which one of the Contender Series alums that you've seen did you know was destined for success? And do you feel slightly biased towards fighters that you've called during the Contender Series?
No, not biased, but you just know more about them. There's just more, because they have a feature even for the Contender Series. So then when they make their UFC debut, it's like, all right, they were already on the Contender Series. They already had a feature shoot. Maybe I called one of those fights. So you just know more about them when you're talking about that level of a fight. Like Brock Weaver, for instance. Like Brock Weaver's like, his story's kind of known. Some of these guys on Contender Series, they barely even have any UFC experience, but they already have more of a name than guys who have fought 3 or 4 times in the UFC, just because of the profile of the show and that sort of thing. That's just kind of the game of combat sports and how they promote it. But, Sean O'Malley, I think, is the easy one. He was on the first night that I called a Contender Series. That was on episode 2 of season 1. That was my first night. And I remember, like, he said going into that fight, like, I'm good enough and I'm marketable enough to be a household name. And I remember thinking, like, man, that's a lot of praise for yourself as a young kid who's not that experienced in turn. Like, he had 8 fights or something like that. And, he was a young kid, skinny kid, whatever. And it's like, man, to say you're going to be not just a big name, but a household name and marketable enough and good enough. I was like, man, he thinks highly of himself, which is good. That's what you need to be. But then for him to have that kind of fight with that stage, and then Snoop Dogg was bringing him up that first night, and he's delivered every time out in the UFC. Obviously, the suspension has kind of slowed him down, but he's coming back again. So I think Sean O'Malley is the one you loop back to. He's kind of like the crown jewel of the Contender Series people so far, just because of what he's been able to do with his name. But, Macy Barber, too. Macy Barber was on that show, and it was pretty clear that she was going to be a pretty real threat when she made it to the big time, and she has proven to be so.
All right. So, as many people here know, you also interview fighters on your podcast, Fits and a Fighter. Now, I know I feel biased towards fighters I interview, but it must be harder for you because you cannot reflect your bias on broadcast. Do you feel any sort of like, I don't know, bias? I know I'm saying that word a lot, but when watching or commentating fighters that you've interviewed on your podcast?
Yeah, try not to be. I think again it comes down to that Contender Series thing where it's certainly I don't try to have it as bias in the broadcast, but I know them more. So like Dan Ige fought Edson Barbosa last week, and I had Dan Ige on my podcast, and then as a result, when I have somebody on my podcast and you sit down with them for an hour plus to get their life story, you have like a real connection all of a sudden, and then you're not like necessarily friends or whatever, but friendly. Like I have Ige's phone number, I can text him, I could like whatever, great win or that sort of thing. And I saw him in the airport. So it's like now when I see him around the like around the UFC building, because he lives in Vegas and trains at the PI, I always say hi to him and chat with him a little bit and that sort of thing. And for Edson Barbosa, I've called a couple of his fights, but I've never sat down with him and done an interview and that sort of thing. It's like I like Edson a lot. Edson's a great fighter. He's been in the UFC for a long time. He's very, very good, very accomplished, and a fun fighter to watch. But like Ige, I know where he grew up. I know what got him into MMA. I kind of know the inspiration he takes from his dad and stories of some of his early fights. So that sort of thing. So I might have just like more information on somebody that I've talked to on my podcast, but I try not. I think I've done a good job so far because, I called Benavidez's title fight against Figueiredo in February, and called Dan Ige. Like I've called a handful of their fights, and I haven't been accused of being biased after having one of them on my podcast. I called Walt Harris's fight last week, and obviously a lot of people were pulling for him because of his situation, and I had him on my podcast 10 days before his stepdaughter went missing. So and so I kind of have a connection with him in terms of just knowing his journey up until that point. So yeah, no, it's been great. I try to keep opinion out of it and just let them tell their stories. And then obviously I have a connection with them, but don't let it cross over into making it a bias.
Well, I think that's excellent. Now, Brendan, I want to sincerely thank you for taking the trip out to the MMA Islands today. Is there anything you want to say to the people out there?
From MMA Islands to Fight Island. So
all right.
We'll see Fight Island. But no, love what you guys do. Thanks for having me on. I'm at Brendan Fitz TV on Instagram, trying to grow my following to be as big as you guys.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thank you for watching this interview. I've been Zach Harkness with MMA Island, and I will see you in the next one.